Boy returns from death with a horrifying message from Jesus. Jacob never saw it coming. 1 second he was pedaling down the familiar road toward home, the cool evening breeze against his face. The next, chaos. A deafening blast of a truck's horn, the screech of tires. Then, impact. Everything went black. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no light, no pain. Just a strange, weightless silence. Then, slowly, his senses returned. But something was different. He felt himself floating, drifting. A strange warmth surrounded him, like a soft embrace. He blinked, confused. Why was he looking down? And that's when he saw it. His own body, lying twisted on the pavement. His bike crumpled beside him, motionless. The flashing red and blue lights of an ambulance painted the street in pulsing color. A crowd had gathered. His mother, oh God, his mother, was kneeling beside him, screaming his name. He tried to move, to speak, to reach for her, but nothing happened. He wasn't in his body anymore. He was above it, suspended in the air, looking down at a scene that should have been impossible. Then something even stranger happened. The noise of the world faded away. The sirens, the voices, his mother's sobs, it all melted into silence. And in that silence he felt a pull. Something was drawing him upward. It started gently, like an invisible thread lifting him from the earth, growing stronger by the second. The street, the people, the flashing lights. They shrank below him. Panic gripped him for a moment, but then something changed. A light appeared above him. Soft at first, like the first hints of sunrise, but then growing, expanding, until it was all he could see. It wasn't just brightness. It was warmth. Peace. A feeling so overwhelming, so powerful, that he suddenly knew, without a doubt, this wasn't a dream. He was somewhere else. Jacob wasn't sure how long he drifted toward the light. Time felt strange, like it had stopped existing altogether. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pull stopped. He was standing, or at least he thought he was standing. There was no ground beneath him, yet he felt as solid as ever. That's when he saw it. A figure stood before him, bathed in golden light, tall, strong, clothed in flowing white robes that seemed to shimmer with their own energy. His face was unlike anything Jacob had ever seen, not just because of its features, but because of the way it radiated something beyond words: love, power, eternity. He didn't need to be told who he was. He just knew. It was Jesus. Jacob's entire being trembled, not out of fear, but something deeper: reverence. He wanted to fall to his knees, to speak, to do anything, but he couldn't move. Not out of force, but because he was completely overcome. Jesus looked at him with eyes that weren't just eyes, they were everything. Jacob felt as if his entire soul was being laid bare before them. Every thought, every memory, every fear. Jesus saw it all. And then he spoke. Not with words, not exactly. There was no sound, no voice in the way Jacob had always understood it. Instead, the message came directly into his being, flowing through him like fire and water all at once. You are not here by accident. Jacob's breath caught. There is something you must see. The light around Jesus pulsed, and suddenly, the world around them changed. It was as if the air itself had split open, revealing a vision beyond reality. Jacob's heart pounded as images began to take shape, unfolding before him like a story only heaven itself could tell. And what he saw next would change everything. The vision unfolded before Jacob's eyes, stretching across eternity like a living tapestry. At first, he couldn't understand what he was seeing. Flashes of images, shifting and changing. Cities filled with people, their faces blurred but unmistakably human. Some were walking with purpose, their eyes glowing with a light of understanding. while others wandered aimlessly, their expressions darkened by confusion and fear. Then, the world itself began to tremble. The ground cracked beneath them, splitting open in jagged lines that pulsed with an eerie red glow. Buildings shook, some collapsing into dust. The sky, once blue and endless, twisted into swirling shades of grey and black. It wasn't just a storm, it was something worse. An unnatural darkness creeping in, swallowing everything in its path. Jacob's heart pounded. He could feel something coming, something ancient, something hungry. He turned to Jesus, desperate for answers, but the expression on his face was solemn. Not fearful, but sorrowful. "The world is approaching a time of great division," Jesus said, his voice like 1,000 whispers carried on the wind. "A war is coming, not a war of flesh and blood, but of spirit. A war for the soul of mankind." Jacob wanted to look away from the destruction, but he couldn't. It was all around him, unfolding in terrifying clarity. People fighting in the streets, families torn apart, lies spreading like wildfire, turning neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. Then, another image took form. A man stood alone in a vast crowd. His back was turned, but Jacob could still recognize him immediately, his unmistakable golden hair catching the dim light. Donald Trump. Why was he seeing this? Why was Jesus showing him this man? Trump stood firm as the crowd around him grew hostile. Some pointed at him, their faces twisted with anger. Others whispered behind his back. The division was clear. Some stood with him, others against. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the shouts and jeers, he did not move. Jesus spoke again, his gaze fixed on the scene. "This man has been chosen." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. "He is far from perfect, yet I have placed my hand upon him for a purpose. Many will deny it. Many will curse his name. But he has been called to stand against the tide of darkness." The vision shifted again. Trump was walking through a vast corridor, shadows pressing in on all sides. But he did not walk alone. There were others, figures at his side, some recognizable, others shrouded in mystery. Some carried torches, pushing back the black mist that threatened to consume them. Jacob turned to Jesus, confusion filling his mind. "But why him?" he asked. Jesus looked at him, and in that moment, Jacob felt the weight of an answer too vast for words. "The ways of heaven are not the ways of men," Jesus said. "People look at the flesh, but I see the heart. I choose whom I will, for the battles to come require strength, and no man is called without reason." Jacob wanted to ask more, but before he could, the vision shifted once again. Now, he saw something even more terrifying. A great darkness was rising, a force unlike anything he had ever imagined. It stretched across the land, infecting everything it touched. People who were once strong now cowered in fear. Others, who had once spoken truth, were silenced. But worst of all were the ones who welcomed the darkness, who let it consume them without question, who believed the lies it whispered into their ears. And above it all, Jacob saw a figure cloaked in shadows, its presence so overwhelming, so suffocating, that he felt himself shrinking beneath its weight. Jesus stood tall beside him, unmoving, his presence the only thing keeping the fear at bay. "The enemy is working," he said. "Even now, he weaves his web, ensnaring those who will not see. He is cunning, and he does not come as destruction, but as a promise." Jacob watched as the darkness slithered into places of power, into leaders, into the hearts of those who held influence. Some welcomed it with open arms, their faces twisting into something no longer human. Others fought against it, their spirits burning with resistance. But the battle was not easy. And then, he saw Trump again, standing at the edge of the battlefield, the shadows reaching for him. Many had abandoned him. Others still stood by his side. But the fight was not over. Jacob turned to Jesus, fear gripping his chest. "What do I do?" he asked. Jesus looked at him, his eyes filled with something beyond time, beyond space. "You must return," he said. "You must tell them." Jacob felt the ground shift beneath him. The vision blurred. A rushing sensation filled his body, pulling him backward, faster and faster. The light around Jesus began to fade, but his voice remained, echoing in Jacob's soul. "The choice is theirs, but the time is short." With one final jolt, Jacob felt himself being thrust downward, back through the tunnel, back toward the broken body he had left behind. And then, with a gasp, his eyes shot open. Jacob gasped for air as his soul was pulled downward, faster and faster, through what felt like an endless tunnel. The warmth of Jesus' presence was fading, the light growing dimmer. He wanted to hold on, to stay in that place of peace, but something was dragging him back, a force he could not resist. And then, pain. A crushing weight settled over his body. His chest ached, his lungs burned. He could hear distant voices, muffled but frantic. His mother, a stranger, a beeping sound. Then, a sharp inhale, his own breath, his own body jolting awake. Jacob opened his eyes to blinding hospital lights. A nurse gasped. His mother screamed, but it was a scream of joy. "Oh my God, he's awake!" The room erupted into motion. Doctors rushed in, hands on his arms, voices shouting instructions. He was alive. He had come back. But even as relief flooded the faces of those around him, Jacob felt something deep inside him had changed. His body was here, but part of him was still in that place. He could still hear Jesus' words ringing in his head. "You must tell them." But tell them what? He had seen things that felt too big, too impossible. Would anyone even believe him? His mother was gripping his hand so tightly her fingers were trembling. Her eyes were wet, her face pale. "Jacob, oh my baby, you weren't breathing, they said..." She choked on her words. "You were gone, Jacob. You were gone for 5 whole minutes." 5 minutes. To Jacob it had felt like hours, days even. He could barely process it before a doctor leaned over him, flashing a light into his eyes, asking questions he barely heard. His head spun. The room blurred. The last thing he remembered was being in the presence of Jesus, the power of his voice, the weight of his words. And now, here he was, back in a world that suddenly felt smaller. The doctors asked him what he remembered. He hesitated. How could he explain it? He looked at his mother, at the way she clung to him, the way she searched his face for answers. He wanted to tell her. But would she believe him? Would anyone? The days that followed were a blur of hospital tests, concerned whispers, and endless questions. The doctors called it a miracle. His mother called it divine intervention. But Jacob knew the truth. He hadn't just been brought back. He had been sent back. And with that came a responsibility. One night, lying in his hospital bed, unable to sleep, he heard it again. The voice, not from his mind, but from somewhere deeper. The choice is theirs, but the time is short. He sat up, heart pounding. The vision of the dark forces, the creeping shadows, the battle for souls. It wasn't just something he had seen. It was something that was coming. But what was he supposed to do? He was just a kid. How could he tell people? How could he make them listen? Then he remembered something else Jesus had said. People look at the flesh, but I see the heart. It didn't matter who he was. It didn't matter how old he was. He had been given a message, and it was his duty to share it. But as he lay there, Staring at the ceiling, a terrifying thought crept into his mind. What if no one listened? What if it was already too late? The day Jacob was released from the hospital, the world felt different. Everything looked the same. His house, the streets, the people. But something had changed. Or maybe it hadn't. Maybe he was the one who had changed. His mother was still treating him like glass, hovering, making sure he was okay with every step. His father was quieter than usual, stealing glances at him like he was trying to understand something he couldn't put into words. Jacob barely spoke on the ride home. His mind was elsewhere. The message. It burned inside him, like an ember waiting to ignite. He had to tell people what he saw, what Jesus told him, what was coming. But how? His first attempt was at the dinner table. His mother had just set down his plate when he finally spoke. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something." They both looked at him, waiting. He took a deep breath. "When I was gone, I saw Jesus." His mother gasped, covering her mouth. His father stiffened. "I saw him," Jacob continued, "and he told me things. He showed me what's coming. There's a war." His father cut in. "A war?" "Not a normal war," Jacob explained. "A war of souls. There's something dark, something trying to take over, and—" His father sighed, shaking his head. "Jacob, you just woke up from a coma. Your brain went through a lot. Maybe you had a dream." "It wasn't a dream," Jacob shouted, frustration rising. "It was real. Jesus showed me. And he showed me Donald Trump." Silence. His mother blinked, looking even more shocked. His father's face twisted into something unreadable. "Trump?" he repeated. Jacob nodded eagerly. "Yes. Jesus said he was chosen. That he's part of something bigger. That there are people trying to bring darkness, and Trump is supposed to stand against them. But people won't see it. They'll turn against him, and if that happens, the darkness will spread faster." His father rubbed his face. "Jacob, listen." "No, Dad, you don't understand." Jacob pushed forward. "Jesus showed me everything. The riots, the chaos, the lies. People turning away from God. He said we have a choice. But time is running out. If we don't stand with the right people, we're going to lose everything." His mother's voice was soft. "Sweetheart, I believe you saw something. I believe that with all my heart." She reached for his hand. "But this is a lot. Maybe you're just confused." "I'm not confused," Jacob insisted. "I know what I saw." But no matter what he said, he could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe him. And that was just the beginning. At school, he tried to tell his friends. They laughed. Some listened at first, but as soon as he mentioned Trump, their faces changed. "Dude, that guy's a joke," one of them said. "No, he's not," Jacob shot back. "Jesus told me." "Jesus told you about Trump?" Another kid scoffed. "Come on, man." Word spread fast. By the end of the week, people were whispering about him in the hallways. "That's the kid who said he talked to Jesus." Some treated him like a freak. Others avoided him altogether. Even the teachers looked at him differently. One of them pulled him aside. "Jacob," she said gently, "I know you've been through something traumatic. But maybe you should talk to someone about these things. A counselor, perhaps." He clenched his fists. Why wouldn't anyone listen? He tried to tell a pastor at church. He thought, at least here they would understand. But even the pastor hesitated. "That's an interesting experience, Jacob," he said. "But we have to be careful with personal visions. The Bible warns about deception too." "Are you saying I'm lying?" "No, son, but are you sure this wasn't just your mind trying to make sense of what happened?" Jacob's stomach twisted. Even here, even in a church. It was happening just like Jesus said it would. People were blind. He spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what to do. He wanted to scream, to shake them, to make them see what was coming. But they wouldn't. They refused. And with each passing day, he felt the warning growing heavier in his chest. The darkness was spreading. He could feel it. Something was coming. But would anyone wake up before it was too late?